I am writing this report in the hopes it will dissuade others from attempting to use Zoloft for recreational purposes. I have effects from this substance that have lasted almost 30 years. To this day, I cannot sleep on my back, and other drugs will give me panic attacks that feel like this drug did when I was under the influence. At the time I took this drug, I was 15 years old. Prior to this experience, I had taken cannabis, methamphetamine, LSD, alcohol, and a massive dose of ephedrine. I'd gotten myself into trouble and was in therapy for drug use and other problems, and was abstaining from illegal drugs, but would still happily take any pill that I'd come across. I didn't list them above because I don't recall all the different pharmaceuticals I took, but I variously came across Flexeril, Vicodin, and Ritalin. My experience with these drugs indicated that with pills, more is better, and therein lay the trap I had unwittingly laid for myself. My girlfriend at the time was prescribed Zoloft. Being a prescription drug that treated depression, in my ignorance at the time, I assumed that it made one feel better. Curious about the effects, I asked her for some. She gave me a 100 milligram pill, with her dose being half that amount. Furthermore, she had been taking Zoloft for some time, and so had slowly adjusted to that dose. I knew nothing about SSRIs, and wanting to get high, I decided to take the whole 100 milligram pill. I figured I'd taken and survived the dreaded LSD. This couldn't possibly be any worse. I took the dose an hour before school started, at around 7 a.m. Throughout the day, I felt no effects except for perhaps a little restlessness. It's hard to say, and at the time I wasn't sure if I actually felt anything, or if I just convinced myself that I had because I had taken a pill and wanted to feel high. As the day rolled on, I stopped thinking about it and still felt nothing definite. 9 hours in, I arrived home from school, went in my room, and sat down on my bed. Suddenly, the effects hit me hard. I experienced a strong visual and tactile hallucination. As I sat down, it felt as though the room had shifted so that the wall behind me felt like it was the ceiling. The carpet in my room began to appear to float towards the far wall. I was thrilled to finally get something out of this drug, but mentally, I felt no different. There was no euphoria, anxiety, or any other shift in mood. That was to change, for the worse. 11 to 13 hours in. The hallucinations began to increase steadily, as did a growing sense of unease. I completely lost my appetite. The hallucinations were relatively uninteresting. Flowing and breathing walls, constant and annoying vertigo, and seeing static. I skipped dinner, and then I heard my sister and brother-in-law come into the living room. It was awful timing. I loved them both, but at this point, I felt totally unable to be around people for conversation, so I just stayed in my room. As darkness fell, I went into the living room, said hello to everyone as quick as I could, and went outside. We lived in the country and had an outbuilding about 500 feet from the house. I walked down to it, where I went to smoke a cigarette and try to get myself under control. 13 to 16 hours in. I stayed in the outbuilding for an unknown amount of time. I smoked several cigarettes. It was dark, and the hallucinations became much more pronounced. The most vivid involved a circle made of glowing human skulls, rotating in a clockwise pattern. My vision was also obscured somewhat by static, and sometimes blue and red dots that would flit in and out across my field of vision like fireflies. I felt incredibly anxious. I started to experience unsettling head rushes, where I would feel like I imagine it feels when one is about to experience a seizure. These were accompanied by a loud whooshing in my ears and a sensation that my eardrums were vibrating. These head rushes were extremely uncomfortable and unsettling. Eventually, I made my way back up to the house. When I got there, everyone had gone to bed. I went to do the same, hoping to sleep this off. 16 to 24 hours in, I laid down to sleep and experienced a night of hell. Up to this night, my habit was to sleep on my back. The hallucinations were out of control. They were not pleasant, having to do with skulls mostly, but also, my vision would be overcome with the static and also colors that would bleed into my field of view. None of it was worth a damn. The experience overall at this point was definitely not worth the hallucinations, and the headspace was horrible. The head rushes would slam my brain over and over again, and eventually, the anxiety became an hours-long panic attack where I was afraid I was going to die. With all the mess going on in my life at the time, I was afraid to tell my parents about it. I just didn't want to cause any new disappointments, especially not with my sister unexpectedly in town. Eventually, as morning came, I was able to get some sleep. When I woke up, my sister and brother-in-law were gone. As it turns out, that was the last time I ever saw her. She died a few years later, and I never got the chance to visit her in Oklahoma again. The aftermath. For weeks after this, I experienced those head rushes. The amount of time I spent trying to sleep on my back gave me PTSD. I have an actual independent diagnosis. For decades, whenever I would try to sleep on my back, or even if I would inadvertently turn on my back in my sleep, I would experience those awful head rushes. Immediately following this experience, I crashed into severe depression. Combined with some other issues in my life at the time, the depression eventually resulted in suicide attempts and several weeks of hospitalization in an inpatient mental institution. Before this experience, I was outgoing and fearless and had never experienced a panic attack. Now I have panic disorder and experience panic attacks to this day. I cannot tolerate SSRIs, and even drugs with weak SSRI behavior, such as tramadol, will induce panic attacks along with the head rushes. The inability to sleep on my back has caused chronic pain in my shoulders and lower back. The static I saw during the experience became permanent. In the dark, the static fills my vision and makes it hard to see. As a result, while I can still see the stars, I haven't been able to appreciate a clear night sky in 27 years. Everything said, it's shocking that one pill taken incorrectly could so severely affect one's life, but here I am. Worst of all, I absolutely worshipped my older sister. The last time I saw her alive, I could barely interact with her. The regret I feel is to this day profound and inexpressible. If there was one decision in my life I can go back and change, this would be it. I suffer to this day due to the ignorance of my youth, and I hope someone reading this is able to avoid the same fate. I was at my friend Clark's, and we were smoking some bud, and he said if you take Zoloft, it will enhance the effects of the pot. Being the dumbass I was, I took 15 100 milligram pills in the space of about 2 hours. This was around 8 p.m. I didn't feel anything for a while, just high from taking bong hits. I stayed the night there, and it was the worst night of my life. I woke up, and I saw my friend Clark standing on the steps with a device that I thought he was trying to kill me with. I looked up at the ceiling, and a giant net was coming down over my head, controlled by my friend of course, and I started waving it away. I looked over, and Clark wasn't there anymore. The next day is still a blur to me. Apparently, I started rambling about how everyone was out to get me, and I wasn't safe anymore. I was smoking lots of pot to try to calm down, but it wasn't working well. Clark called a doctor, and he said I was suffering from schizophrenia. Later that day, though, I calmed down enough to go home. I have never been the same since that night. I hear voices in my head, and sometimes I'll see someone, and then they're not there. I hear people calling my name all the time, but they're not. I have the symptoms of a paranoid schizophrenic, and I blame the Zoloft. I wish I can go back and undo that terrible night, but I can't. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this video so far. It's like giving a waiter or waitress a tip for eating at a restaurant. That's why I compare the two. Subscribe as well if you're new here, and comment down below if you take Zoloft or if you have taken it before and it affected you like this, or just anything. I have personally taken Zoloft a couple times, and every time I really didn't feel anything, but I would yawn a lot and I would just be smiling more. I don't know. It didn't really make me want to do it again. I did it a couple times just to see if maybe the next time would change, and I'm kind of glad that it stopped because I could have ended up like one of these people. So these people are very unlucky, and I'm just glad that nothing happened to me like that. So I wouldn't really recommend it if you're not prescribed it. If you're clinically depressed, then yes, take it, because it's one of the best antidepressants out there. So continue to take it. But if you're looking to get high, don't just put this away. It doesn't get you high, trust me. All right, let's move on to the next story. I've always been interested in experimenting with drugs of all kind, but those that terrify me, such as crystal meth. I've smoked weed a whole bunch of times, and have never enjoyed it. Doesn't do much for me as I either A, stare at a wall, or B, throw up for hours. So when I was offered a line of coke, I jumped at the chance. I've always been especially interested in snorting for some reason. Anyway, this is about what happened after I did the coke. Of course, I want to do it again, but in the meantime, I've been searching for something legal and cheaper. I have a prescription for Zoloft, so I decided to try that. Bad idea. I chopped up one 50 milligram pill and cut it into 5 lines. I had this weird notion that a similar portion up my nose would possibly burn less, if it burned at all. I snorted up one 10 milligram line into my left nostril at 9 p.m. It was alright for about 30 seconds, then the burning started. Felt pretty much like I had just snorted wasabi. I could have handled that, but within 10 minutes, the burning moved up my sinus cavity and into the side of my head. My ear felt like it was burning off. This feeling continued for about 30 minutes. Finally, the pain in my ear subsided, but the pain in my nostril was still the same. The drip started at around 10:15, very salty, and I couldn't sniff it in or blow it out without the original intensity coming back. So I pretty much sat still in front of my TV, trying to breathe through my mouth, breathing through my right nostril, breathing in through my mouth and out my nose. Nothing helped. At around 11 p.m., the intense pain was gone, but my left nostril was extremely sore and stuffy, and if I sniffed, it really hurt, still a bit of a drip. I went to bed at around 12 a.m. and could still feel it. Obviously, I didn't snort enough to know whether or not Zoloft will give you a buzz in this way, especially because I take it regularly. I would have had to snort a lot. All I know is today, my nostril is stuffed up and I had a terrible sinus headache most of the morning. Moral of the story, snorting Zoloft sucks. So I was just one of the many children in the late 20th to 21st century who was clinically diagnosed with severe depression. My psychiatrist recommended Zoloft. I was a small kid, maybe 100 pounds sopping wet, and they started me with a modest 25 milligram dose. This was fine for the first 2 weeks. After the second week though, I started to feel strangely, starting first thing in the morning. I told my doctor, and she said it was due to the drug finally taking effect and the unpleasantries would disappear once it's fully built up in my bloodstream. To accelerate that process, she doubled my dose. Then, I really didn't feel right. I would lay awake at night, despite 100 milligrams of trazodone, with racing thoughts. I could not control them, horrible thoughts that I don't even want to make mention of. The days seemed endless, and I constantly had this indescribable discomfort, always. It was almost like an itch under my skin that I couldn't quite place. It felt difficult to communicate with people. I felt like no one understood me, and I felt sad. All things one should not expect from an antidepressant. Again, I told my doctor about it, and she again dismissed my distress. She put me up to 100 milligrams per day, so now each and every single pound in my body had its very own milligram worth of poison every day. It took less than a week before it became unbearable. Each day, I felt panicked. I was uncontrollably irritable and lashed out at teachers and my fellow peers. I didn't talk to hardly anyone. Going home was like being sent to die. I would explode with tears and fury when I got home, arguing with my parents and sobbing myself to sleep. As I said, it was less than a week into school until I broke down. I lashed out at a teacher and began screaming and sobbing about God knows what. I don't remember it much, but I remember my school counselors, principals, and security all taking me down to the office. I was crying uncontrollably, and I wanted to die. I told them so. I told them exactly how and why I wanted to die. I wanted to die because I deserved it. They kept asking me what happened, why I blew up and went into a rage. I started screaming about what a particular teacher had done and some kids that I had despised, and that one of the counselors was calling me names and antagonizing me while I was in the hallway. The only trouble was that none of that ever happened. All of the things I was angry about and telling them that happened never did. I was lost. They explained to me that the teacher I was talking about, I hadn't even had their class yet, so I hadn't even seen them. I could not wrap my mind around it. I became confused. I was frantic and wild. I got on top of the table and started crying and screaming. It felt like only a moment there, on that table, crying, trying to bear this torture somehow. It was much more than a moment though. It was almost an hour. And before I knew it, my parents were walking in the door, confused and frightened. Within another hour, I was committed to the psychiatric hospital, locked away without so much a lace in my shoes for fear of what I would do to myself with it.